today's interview, we will explore the origin, implication, and future relevance of the concept superdemic. And with me, we are joined by Dr. Professor Sunil Raina. He is professor and head of Department of Community Medicine, Dr. RPGMC Tanda. And in his recent editorial in Journal of Public Health and Primary Care, he introduces the concept of the term superdemic, which shows the challenging the traditional epidemic and pandemic framework. So, in this interview, we will explore this term. And to begin with, sir, could you please tell us what led you to propose this term, the word superdemic?
There is an interesting story behind it. Why I was interested in finding a term for what we saw during COVID-19 pandemic. My understanding of epidemics and pandemics was limited largely by the binary of epidemic, pandemic, or even an endemic. But I realized over a period of time when the pandemic of COVID-19 was evolving that this doesn't typically fit into the descriptions that were there for infectious diseases for last 1,000 years or so, more than that. And I worked on the idea what alternative terms we could have for COVID-19 in particular. And initially, I thought of labeling it or classifying it as something like a hyper object. Hyper object was the closest that I thought this COVID-19 pandemic resembles to. And I broached this idea on Twitter with some of my friends who were working on COVID-19 pandemic. And then when I said that this resembles more of a hyper object than a pandemic, and the people who have been promoting this idea of hyper object agreed with this. They said, yes, this is more like a hyper object than a pandemic. But I was initially reluctant to use this term hyper object also because of the fact that I wanted something which was in the traditions of labeling diseases as pandemic, endemic, epidemic. The demic part was missing in hyper object. So just to make that continuity there and yet see the departure from the fact that it was not a pandemic, I zeroed in on this superdemic as a term for this particular COVID-19 infection. And over a period of time, I realized that infections like COVID-19, not just COVID-19, but infections who have a large impact in societies in general, do get bracketed or should be bracketed in this term superdemic than in an epidemic or a pandemic binary only.
So, sir, so in your definition, you use terms like high impact, large scale, which affects the mental, social, and economic health of individual or community. So, how do you quantify these things? How do you justify your definition?
Actually, I don't want to quantify it. Quantification doesn't actually measure the scale of the impact that disease like COVID-19 have, because quantification usually brackets it into or puts into a matrix. And the impact of COVID-19, or even for that matter tuberculosis, is more cascading, is more transformative. It's not something which can be captured in a simple matrix. But if you want me to quantify it, I would say, while on one hand we can talk about the biomedical relevance of the disease itself in terms of the number of people who are infected, the number of hospitalizations that happen, the case fatality that is there, the hospital bed capacity that is overwhelmed, the ICUs that are compromised. Now we don't have an ICU to keep the patient. We need to find an alternative place for keeping the patients. So that's one aspect of quantifying the impact of the disease. But there are others as well. For example, in COVID-19, we realized that beyond the hospitals, our labor markets were compromised. Our schools were closed. The offices were asked to work in a particular way. For example, the concept of working from home is something which was given to us by COVID-19. So this was more of a cultural technical shift that we had not observed with other diseases prior to COVID-19. And as I said, we saw that the markets were closed, the labor forces were forced to, the labor market was forced to shift from one place to another. We didn't have enough of uh, logistics to transport them, and we could see people running on the road or moving on the road like anything. So it was not just an impact on the economic aspect of labor, it was also an impact on the social aspect of labor itself. So you could measure it through changes in the GDP that have happened over a period of time. Even in the change that has happened with regard to the life expectancy. If you look at those 5 years, the life expectancy in even the most developed of countries has dropped down. So it's not just about that particular event, it's also the fact that what that particular event will have over a period of time. Then you had, because of COVID, you realize that acute infections do have a long-term impact in terms of developing long COVID as a disease. And now we realize that it's not just with long COVID that you have a long-term impact. You have similar impacts with events which happen in an acute way, infectious events which happen in an acute way. They do leave a long-term sequelae, much like the non-communicable diseases, and that long-term sequelae needs to be taken care of. So it's more of a framework that fits this disease than a simple matrix which will tell us, yes, this number has been achieved and we should be labeling it as a superdemic.
Sir, by your answer, you are saying this is something a long-term condition. So, just like PHEIC, Public Health Emergency of International Concern, or the pandemic, do we declare the superdemic?
We should be declaring a superdemic like the PHEIC or the pandemics. We should be declaring a superdemic with the insights that we will have once the pandemic, as per the definition currently existing, is evolving. So once we realize that this infectious event is not just impacting life in terms of mortality and morbidity, but it is also impacting our socio-cultural context. It's also impacting our infrastructure. It is also impacting our economy. It's also impacting our political life. So once you see that the infectious event is of such a nature, we should be labeling it beyond the pandemic or endemic binary and move more towards a superdemic. In terms of developing measurements, we should over a period of time have specific measurements wherein we can say the cutoffs, just because of the fact, not that they're important, just because of the fact that you will have to have you will need to establish a comparison from existing definitions for pandemics or endemics, and you have to have a clear cut classification for superdemic. So maybe you will need to develop those metrics over a period of time. But as I said, metrics won't justify the event as such. This event is something which will always be beyond metrics, and it will be an evolving dynamic thing, and will have to be adjusted and adopted as per the emerging context of the disease itself.
That means for a new disease or emerging or re-emerging disease, when and how do we declare that this disease is superdemic for new disease?
As I said, once the disease will happen, most of the diseases will start with a few cases only. It won't be that all of a sudden you will have a billion cases happening around you in day one. The cases will evolve over a period of time.
Yes.
But once we realize that it's not just our capacity in terms of biomedical uh, logistics which is being compromised, when we realize that it is also influencing our socio-cultural context. For example, we had to initiate a lockdown. Imagine initiating a lockdown for a disease like we did in COVID-19, which literally put everything to halt. So if you feel that your current means of dealing with the disease are limited, and the disease is so overwhelming that it is capable of transforming the life of an individual, the society, the polity, then you should be classifying it as a superdemic. So that's something that happened with COVID itself.
Yes, sir. So, do you believe the current public health curriculum adequately prepared the professionals to deal with the superdemic scale disruption?
If you are trying to ask me this in a yes no situation, I would say no, it doesn't. Because the current curriculum doesn't actually capture the complexity of the disease evolution as a process in itself. What I mean to say is that uh, diseases have evolved, they keep evolving. So they have been evolving for last thousands of years. But our understanding of disease has not kept pace with how disease have evolved. One. Second, diseases interact. They don't interact with just human beings. Unfortunately, our understanding of disease is limited to the infectious agent or an agent and the host. We generally limit it to that. But diseases are actually diseases emerge actually through an interaction of a whole lot of processes. And things around us have not stayed the same for last 100 years. I give an example. If you think of a world 100 years back, you would imagine that the chance of an infection reaching from one place to another would be a month or so. But if you imagine it a world now, if you think of the world now, the chance of an infection reaching from one part of the world to another part of the world is less than 24 hours. So the world has changed a lot around us. Travel is one of the key factors that has changed the world around us. It's not just travel that has changed the world around us. We are much more uh, interactable in a sense that our chances of picking up infection is higher than we had maybe 1,000 years, because we were limited, restricted to certain geographies. It doesn't happen that way now. And over a period of time, the organisms themselves have evolved in a way that their capacity to infect different population as different at different places in different geographies has changed. It's not stayed the same, and disease are become much more complex, much more layered. Interventions are not as easy as they were maybe 100 years back. They are again more layered. They have more context to it. So in that sense, public health or teachings of public health have not evolved. And as I said, the best part of the public health was done maybe 100 years back. The public health that we now do is not up to the level of the challenges that we have, public health challenges that we have in the current century. They are vastly different from what they were 100 years back. But public health did not evolve within those 100 years to meet the challenges that are there now. So in that sense, yes, our curriculum is not in a position to tackle these challenges. It doesn't teach you enough. It doesn't train you enough to deal with these challenges.
So, would that mean that terms like epidemic, endemic, or pandemic, they are surrounded around the geographical context? So, are these terms overdated now, or should we skip using these terms?
Geographical contextualization is not bad actually, but geographical limitation of understanding is bad. If you are trying to understand a disease in a geographical context, that is fine. That's absolutely fine, because your interventions may always be uh, better suited to a geographical context. It's like you have a running stream, and most of the outcomes of the stream will be felt downstream. So outcomes won't be upstream. And if you have to make an intervention of the outcomes on the outcomes, you will have to work downstream. So geographical contextualization will always be helpful. You will know what works the best here, why is the disease happening here. But limiting it to geographical understanding, that look, if it is limited to a particular area, if it goes beyond particular area, the classifications change. That's something which is worrisome, because of the fact that the geographical boundaries or the geographical limitations of understanding have changed.
Yes.
Our understanding of disease, our even the fact that disease transmission dynamics have changed because of the fact that the geographical limits have washed away, they have waned away. But the contextualization still stays. So if you are saying that if the disease is limited to this area, it's an endemic. If it goes beyond this area, it's a pandemic. Is something which is very limited and constrained wave of the disease itself.
Yes, sir.
This should be a part of the defining the disease, but there have to be other components of that have to be there also while we are trying to identify a disease or define a disease.
So, by taking the example of COVID-19 only, can you describe how the centralized response failed to communicate during COVID-19 from the point of Superdemic?
I would say it failed to communicate. I would
Yes,
say
sir.
that it would always be better when you have a situation of such scale, a crisis of such scale, wherein a decentralized approach will be more helpful. Primarily because of the contextualization, as I said. Looks, most of the solutions have to be found at the ground. They won't be found at the top. Solutions will always be found at the ground, and they have to be contextualized to a particular setting, geography, situation. It's always rooted there. uh, Once we develop a policy or a program wherein the importance of the contextualization is limited, we are always at a chance, at a risk of not being able to control the disease effectively. That's something that may have happened with COVID. I won't say it happened with COVID, But the problem with COVID was this was a crisis of its own. It was once in a lifetime crisis. You don't see such crises always. So maybe the responses were also of a nature which were not prepared to leave it to a decentralized approach, because you were always worried of the fact that the knowledge capital, the infrastructural capital, the resource capital at the decentralized level may not be good enough to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe a more centralized approach wherein you had more knowledge capital in terms of scientific awareness, in terms of being able to roll out interventions was more at the centralized level. So maybe they thought of using a centralized approach, more centralized approach to COVID-19. But if you're trying to have more long-term sustainable interventions for a disease like COVID or something like that, you need to have a decentralized approach wherein the resources, the scientific capabilities, the infrastructure is of a level which is as good as that of the centralized approach, and then only you will be able to take care of this pandemic. So maybe I would suggest that we need to create more decentralized hubs for management of diseases like COVID than a single centralized way of dealing with the pandemics, like dealing with the disease like COVID.
So, if you were given a chance to go back to the history to the 2020 year, what would you like to change about public health implication during the COVID-19 using the example of decentralized?
Now, one of the things that I would want to change, I would have wanted to change, or I would have wanted to use was maybe strengthen the initial 3 months, the initial 3 month part of the COVID-19 pandemic intervention phase itself. When we said that we have initiated a lockdown, and then we have initiated a number of interventions with which we are trying to reduce the impact of the disease. Maybe what I would have done is that I would have utilized that 3 month period to extend the benefits, or extend the interventions in a more decentralized ways, wherein the capacities of people who are dealing with the pandemic at the ground level was raised to a level wherein the cascading effect of the pandemic itself were met with by them on their own. What I mean by that is, so after 3 months of pandemic itself, most of us who were working on the ground or at the state level were waiting for revised orders, revised directives, revised guidelines from one source only, and then we were approaching the local situation of COVID-19 through those guidelines. What I would have wanted was that within these 3 months period, I would have wanted that each of those states or each of those places wherein the COVID pandemic was evolving were able to develop their own context, were able to develop their own interventions specific to their own populations, which would have been more locally relevant as well as uh, tailored to the resources that were available at the local level, so that they didn't have to depend on everything to one information source, despite the fact that 3 months of the infection had happened. So maybe that, as I said, more decentralized approach, but all decentralized people or all decentralized institutions should have been able to develop their own capacity to deal with the pandemic at the local level. So that's something that I would have changed. This is something that I again say now, this is something that the public health needs to do. All states of this country need to have good enough public health understanding as well as infrastructure to be able to contextualize the disease and to be able to deal with the diseases at the local level through whatever is available with them in terms of knowledge resources, in terms of infrastructure, or in terms of being able to deliver an intervention. So maybe they need to strengthen themselves.
Learning from the example of COVID-19. So, can you please elaborate pro- how can we prevent future or current superdemics, and what are the current superdemics?
COVID-19 was once in a lifetime event, but it's as I always say, it's these once in a lifetime events that will have the maximum impact. So, because we are not actually prepared for these COVID-19 like events, we generally are prepared for events that we see on a daily basis or anticipate on a daily basis. But COVID-19 was something which we had not anticipated, or even if we had anticipated, we had always said or thought about the fact that the likelihood of this event happening in a lifetime is very remote. But the fact is that COVID-19 happened and it changed everything. The best way to prevent the impact of COVID-19 like events is to be prepared for it. And how do we prepare for it is to have an insight of what might transform into a COVID-19 like event. Look, when an infection happens, as I said, infection may happen as a unitary, it may happen as a single case, maybe 10 cases. But the variability, the difference that these 10 cases or one case has from the existing set of cases that we have a particular disease, or the fact that these 10 cases or 20 cases don't behave the way traditional understanding of an infectious agent or an infectious disease is supposed to behave. So, an infectious agent or infectious disease is supposed to behave in a particular way. But these 10-20 cases are not behaving in that particular way. They are different. Despite the fact that out of these 20 cases, 18 may behave in the traditional way, but 2 cases out of these 18 cases may not be behaving in a traditional way, should alert us. So, every infection that happens around us, if there is something abnormal in that infection around us, we need to be alerted. We should think that this has the potential of going beyond what we have known about the disease for so long. So that's when we will be able to capture newer pandemics or newer epidemics or newer superdemics, which have an impact which will be long lasting and which will be cascading and long lasting. So that's something that we should have done with COVID also, because I remember telling people that when you saw COVID for the first time, people talked about anosmia as a very important feature of COVID-19. But a lot of us neglected it and said that, look, most of the respiratory infections do come with anosmia. But the predominance of the symptom itself, the predominance of the fact that anosmia was so common, so strong, so impacting, that we didn't see the similar type of anosmia in other acute respiratory infections, should have alerted us. This is something different. This is not what we have been observing with regard to acute respiratory infections for last maybe 100 years. So if you are able to pick those slightly different things which are not there in our existing knowledge with regard to infections, we have a chance of picking up something which may turn out to be greatly impacting as far as infections are concerned.
In your article, besides COVID, you use tuberculosis as an example of superdemic. So, do you think the current superdemics are mainly the airborne diseases?
Airborne infections have a greater chance of creating a superdemic, primarily because of the fact that all of us breathe air, and air as such needs to be identified as a determinant for disease as such, not in a sense, in a negative sense, but air has to be identified as a determinant factor for being capable of causing an infection or transmitting infections. Because as I said, almost all of us breathe air. So the chance of infection coming from one person to another through air are higher than they are through water or other sources around us. So in that sense, if you look at the potential of infections becoming super endemic, airborne infections have a higher chance. And that's what history has always taught you. You to talk about pandemics like influenza, you talk about pandemics like the Spanish flu or even the Russian flu. So they have always been related with the airborne infection, primarily because of the fact that air is the easiest means of transmission.
So, regarding the term superdemic, so do you think people can use it or even misuse the term?
The term can be used and misused, depends upon who is using it. But the fact is that when I coined the term, my idea was to build a narrative or create an information sense of something which goes beyond the existing binary of of an endemic and pandemic, epidemic and pandemic. And my idea was to capture the concept of disease being able to not just kill or cause ill health, increase hospitalization, but also to have a long term impact which will keep multiplying over a period of time. That was the idea of when I coined the term superdemic. Regarding misuse, if somebody is going to misuse it in terms of creating panic out of the term itself, that's something that all definitions, all terms have a liability of. All terms and definitions can be misused or misinterpreted. Superdemic will also have the same fate in those situations.
So, do you think the term superdemic have some limitation in your opinion?
I agree there is a limitation in terms of it. One of the greatest limitation probably is its measurability, as you pointed out in the earliest time. I intentionally did not want it to be measurable, but over a period of time, I'm realizing that its measurability may be a limitation in a sense because comparisons will be difficult to establish. And unfortunately, we realize that comparison is the key as far as public health is concerned. We generally love comparisons. We need to have an understanding of before and after. We need to have an understanding of A and B.
Yes.
So in that sense, maybe measurability will always be a problem with Superdemic. But I think post this interview, I should be developing a measurable criteria for Superdemics, and that's one of the ways we can develop. But as I said, I am not very fond of combining 5, 6, 7 components which go into making of a super endemic into one single metric or one single index, because that defies the very purpose of having a broad framework for defining the term itself. So that's how I see it. But yes, for being making measurable, it's useful to develop some criteria to make it more measurable.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for giving us your precious time, and we hope we'll have more future interactions with you. Thank you,
Thank you.
sir.